Good afternoon to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jabin Jacob, and respected Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences and head of the Foreign Languages Department, Tejpur University, Professor Prasant Kumar Das, and faculty member of Foreign Languages Department, Ratazit Chakravarti, Deviru Lanamai, and Pallavi from Japanese language, and all are from Chinese language. On behalf of the Foreign Language Department, Tejpur University, it is a great pleasure to welcome you all on this webinar on Chinese foreign policy. The topic of the webinar is the Communist Party of China's foreign policy of regime, survival, status, and power. I am Jaishree Bora, a visiting fellow in the department, and I thank you all for joining us virtually today. With the pandemic and the India-China standoff that happened throughout 2020, I'm sure a lot of you are interested in learning about how Chinese foreign policy work. So it is an immense privilege for me to introduce to you all to very distinguished Dr. Gavin Jacob. Dr. Jacob is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shivnadar University, India. He is also an adjunct research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. Dr. Jacob's analysis on Chinese foreign policy, India-China relations, and understanding contemporary China is of utmost interest to Indian as well as worldwide audience, as he has a very unique understanding and analysis, and his analysis explains China from an Indian perspective. He was also a former fellow and associate director at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi, and associate editor of the journal China Report. Jacob holds his PhD in Chinese Studies from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has also spent a tremendous amount of time research for his research in Taiwan, France, and Singapore. As a part of his research, Dr. Jacob has also traveled in many of India's border states and visited part of the country's disputed borders with China and Pakistan, as well as international borders with Myanmar and Bangladesh. He was also a part of Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor, and he was actively engaged with the project when the project was on run. He is now also a PhD supervisor at the Naval War College, Goa, and a regular speaker at various other Indian defense training institutions. He is a member of the editorial board of Review for Indian and Asian Studies and Institute for Indian and Southwest Asian Studies of Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences and the NMF Journal, Maritime Affairs. Dr. Jacob has recently published a co-edited volume. The name of his book is China's Search for National Rejuvenation, Domestic and Foreign Policies under Xi Jinping. The book discusses not only foreign policy, but also the domestic forces driving current Chinese growth, ranging from economic reforms to governance practices. And it also analyzes their impact and influence both inside China as well as China's foreign and security policies, that is its near and extended neighborhood. Um, so it's for me, it's been a really, I feel very fortunate to know and have Dr. Jacob as my mentor since the day I started studying China. With this brief introduction, I invite Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences and Head of Foreign Languages at Tejpur University, Prasant Kumar Das, to moderate and inaugurate the session.
Okay, thank you, Jashri, and please allow me 2 minutes, a minute or two. I'd just like to mention that the Department of Foreign Languages in Tejpur University is a very young department. We began in 2019. And currently we have a certificate course in Chinese, and we have choice-based courses in French and German. But we have plans, and we are excited about a customized course that we are offering to the Indian Army at their request. This began last Monday. And for us, this webinar is significant. We've had a couple of webinars, but that was more on pedagogical aspects of teaching. And a topic like this one is entirely new for us. And we'd like to have more of this kind of webinars, and when things are better, maybe even a seminar on campus. And we hope that Dr. Jacob will visit us at some time in the future. Without further ado, then, may I invite Dr. Jacob to kindly deliver his talk.
Thank you, Professor Das at the Department of Foreign Languages at TESPU University for this invitation. Thank you, Jayashree, also for organizing this invite and for that it is pretty embarrassing to sit through such a long introduction of oneself. But now that you've sort of built me up, I suppose there's a fair degree of pressure on me to sort of live up to that, to those expectations. I've recognized several names already in the list of participants, and so some of you have already heard me speak before. What I'm going to try and do in this particular meeting is, not something very extraordinary, but what I wanted to do was put together a bunch of stuff that actually many of you already know of, but try and put it in a framework that I thought would be interesting from the perspective of those already conversant or familiar with China and trying to take their expertise to the next level. So I sort of deliberately, let me just add that, when I was at the ICS, we organized this program called the ICS Scholar in Residence. And that was my first attempt to try and get to TESPU University. Unfortunately, I could not make it, but my colleague then at the time, Dr. Arvind Yellary, did come to the department. I think it was the Department of Political Science, perhaps, or Sociology. One of those departments in which we had done this very brief module on China at that point in time. But yes, I certainly will look forward to coming to TESPUR. I've been here before, but not to the university itself. And I'm glad to hear from Professor Das that this program for the Indian Army has finally taken off. I've been hearing of it for a very long time, but I'm glad that it has finally taken off. I choose to refer not to China's foreign policy, but to the Communist Party of China's foreign policy, if nothing else, to underline the fact that this is a particular regime that we are talking about. And therefore, since we talk about a particular regime, it's important to understand that for this particular regime, the Communist Party of China, it is its own interests, its regime interests that take first priority over and above what we would normally understand as national interests. In fact, for the party, regime interest and national interest are fused. And if we forget this particular reality, we tend to be confused about China's intentions, China's line of behavior, and what China will do next. Because this is not how normal countries would conduct foreign policy. These are the priorities of normal countries in the conduct of foreign policy, which is about protecting their image, protecting, their citizens. Some of these actually do not really count as much for China because it's dominated and ruled and by the Communist Party of China, and does not necessarily function in the state interest. In fact, when we talk about a foreign ministry, this is naturally a state organization. Whereas in China, while it has a foreign ministry, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually not the most important player in the Chinese system as far as foreign policy is concerned. There are multiple other party organizations that can outrank the MOFA, and whose interests actually come before any advice or objective that the MOFA might lay out for the People's Republic of China. So I look at three specific issues here in terms of examining the CPC's foreign policy. One is the question of regime survival, the other of status, and finally of power. Now, status and power is where the interests of the Communist Party of China and the interests of the People's Republic of China, which that is of the party and the state, tend to merge or to tend to converge more closely. So let me start with regime survival. Now, obviously, ensuring regime survival means that China has, embarked on some pretty strange, to normal foreign policy analysts, a pretty strange or surprising moves in terms of its foreign policy. For example, let's start with something, in the last century, which is the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, right? The massacre of students and laborers by the Chinese regime. The Chinese regime carried out in full international glare. You must remember that Mikhail Gorbachev had just arrived in China the previous month, and they could not give him a formal welcome at Tiananmen Square because that was occupied by the students. So, at that time, the Communist Party of China held its peace. It continued to negotiate with the students. But for various reasons, at the beginning of June, the party decided that this was getting out of hand. The party's survival itself was at stake, and it did not care about international opprobrium or the cost to China's image that its actions would create. So you had over that one particular day on June 4th and a few hours either side of it, an exercise which led to the deaths of still unaccounted numbers. But the Communist Party essentially survived. It took longer for the PRC to regain its status and image, but this is the sort of thing that the Communist Party continues to do. Even today, if you look at the sort of censure that China faces because of what it is doing in Xinjiang, what we see as a big difference between Xinjiang and Tiananmen is that China is also in a position to react much more strongly, to build counter narratives and so on. So this particular aspect, this sort of thick skin when it comes to the national image, how people might look at Chinese citizens abroad. Whether Chinese citizens abroad will suffer because they are part of an authoritarian regime, or all of those concerns don't matter to the people at Chongnanhai, the seat of Chinese power in China. And I just mentioned that China builds up a counter narrative, so it uses a couple of party bodies to achieve this particular goal. In addition to the MOFA, of course, there is something known as the United Front Work Department and the International Liaison Department, both of which are party organs that are designed to deal with other political parties, intellectuals from different streams or sectors of China, of first and foremost the Chinese economy, of the Chinese society, and then of intellectual and business and political elites of other countries. So, this is just a very short telegraphic summary of what these two particular organizations do. Now, it speaks to the success of these particular organizations that you see the situation of how Chinese scholars do not appear to criticize the Communist Party of China. It's not quite true that they don't criticize, but in international forums, on the international stage, or in front of foreigners, there seems to be very much a grand unity behind the Communist Party of China. Part of this has to do with the way the Communist Party of China operates within its borders. But you also now find there are intellectuals abroad, outside of China's borders, who are willing to speak the Chinese line. There's any number of people that you will see writing in the China Daily, in the Global Times, foreigners who, by the way, admission that I myself have written for the People's Daily, but this was I discovered to my cost later. I mean, early in my career, that this was a heavily edited eventually it ended up heavily edited. But the thing is, you learn from that mistake and you decide that, okay, you're not going to do this again, because they're going to twist. And I stopped giving interviews also to Chinese journalists, because they're likely to twist or take statements out of context or use it much later than when you originally gave the interview. But there are several people that do this, continue to do this, and this really speaks to the success of these party bodies in co-opting intellectuals from other countries to achieve party goals, to make the party look better. Now, many of you are students, and I just want you to know that by comparison, certainly Indian scholars look bad because they're constantly criticizing the government, constantly criticizing their policymakers. But of course, to criticize and to challenge is a normal state of being. The challenge that China provides is that it seems to normalize siding with the government or siding with the party as the right thing to do. Far from it. And China has a long history of intellectual dissent. Of course, it's come at great cost, but it does have a history of objecting to or dissenting against the state. Now, business elites. This is important because you just saw recently how Jack Ma's Alibaba was prevented from, launching its IPO. Right? It's pretty much clear that Jack Ma is under the control of the Communist Party of China. Many people were surprised when it was announced that Jack Ma is a Communist Party of China member. But it's impossible for anybody to make it big in China if he or she were not connected to the party in some way. So in a sense, the business elites are co-opted in China. And this is part of what gives the regime its resilience, its strength, that there are no sectors of this society, no powerful sectors of society which are apart from the party. The party is over everybody. So if you say that, well, we will not do business with the Chinese public sector, but we can do business with Chinese private sector, I ask you, what is a private sector in China? There is no such thing as a private sector in China, because the private sector is under the thumb of the party at all times. One final point here, which is the co-opting of minority elites. Now, we we are talking, well, at least virtually in the northeast of India, where multiple ethnicities contend for power and the gains of the benefits of power. And there is the one big part of this is the interaction between the elites of these ethnic groups and their interactions with the central government. In China, and as you probably will also know, that also in India, the way the Chinese Communist Party has co-opted minority elites in areas that are strategically important for China, Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, or the northeast of China, is by creating divisions within those minority communities. There's a conflict created between those who ostensibly support development and those who wish to preserve their culture, their traditions, and their heritage. It's almost put as a conflict between development and the Stone Age. But there isn't supposed to be a conflict between development and preservation of the environment. This is not an either-or situation. But the nature of the Chinese CPC elite, the technocratic elite, is to see things in black and white and to create this sort of an artificial division in which it sees religion as a remnant of feudalism, for example, in Tibet, or as something that holds people back, keeps people backward in Tibet and Xinjiang elsewhere. So even uses the argument that minority languages are somehow not equipped to bring modernity to these minorities. And all of these, therefore, the imposition of a national language of Mandarin across the country as a way of partaking of modernity, all of these are the different strategies that the Communist Party of China uses in order to ensure regime survival. And of course, these then have implications for China's foreign policy, because no other country in the world has as many foreign neighbors as China does. But nearly all of China's border areas are dominated by minorities. And therefore, to keep those minorities in check on the straight and narrow, as defined by the Communist Party of China, is very much part of Chinese foreign policy, right? And if one were to go by the data of voting at the National People's Congress, which is sort of the equivalent of, a rough equivalent of the Lok Sabha, even though it is pretty much a rubber stamp, shows that since Xi Jinping came to power, the number of no votes or abstentions has actually declined, and the number of yeas to different Chinese legislation has actually increased over time, which seems to indicate that there is, great deal of support, or an increasing degree of support for Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping's ideas of what the Communist Party of China is doing or should do. Let me come to status seeking. There is no doubt that the third world identity, or the identity of China as a developing country, is very much an important part of China's identity. This is very important for the Chinese as part of their approach to seeking power and legitimacy outside of its borders, because they see themselves as a developing country. They see themselves as having some lessons for other developing countries, and often during the Maoist era, involvement in Africa and different parts of the world, while they were of course seeking to promote revolution, but they were also, when they were involved in development or aid projects, they actually were pretty altruistic in many respects. But you see how this has changed currently. I mean, take the simple case of vaccine diplomacy. All right, here, you could say yes, there's a degree of wanting to help other countries, but you look at the narrative behind this. The narrative is essentially about trying to prove that the novel coronavirus did not originate from China, and that China has done and continues to do not just all that it can do, but that it does more than any other country to counter the pandemic. And therefore, you have the case that even though countries are willing to forget, that China was the origin of the virus and so on, China continues to feel a little worried that unless people accept this narrative 100%, that China is not the origin of the virus, then it might be the case that at some future date, countries might bring it up as a stick to beat China with. Therefore, they're going hammer and tongs on this narrative, as well as trying to ensure that their vaccines are being used by everyone. I mean, you have this crazy rule right now of China saying that India and several other countries, people from India and several other countries can come back to China, but as long as they take the Chinese vaccine shot. Now, this is simply not possible in a country like India, where India doesn't need vaccines from China because it is the largest producer of vaccines itself, which essentially means that a lot of people are not going back to China anytime soon. So here, essentially, China is holding the rest of the world hostage to its own insecurities. And it sees that vaccine diplomacy, the acceptance of its narrative, is part of the acceptance of its status as not just a rising power, but now as the putative world number one, right? And to this end, it has engaged in the multiple other narratives as well to say that vaccines by foreign countries were ineffective or even dangerous. Now, the other point is that China's projects, are abroad, are about also seeking status. Obviously, nobody does it for, offers free lunches anymore. Every country, even India, tries to promote infrastructure and other projects abroad as a matter of trying to get foreign policy points, as a matter of status. But China is somewhat different in the sense that it does not only relate this to its current status as a modern people's republic, but also tries to posit it as part of a long tradition, a legacy of Chinese greatness. All right, that China was a great power in the past, and it always gave to the outside, and therefore it continues that practice today in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. In a sense, what you have is a modern political party with a view of history and of the future that is more in tune with imperial China rather than this People's Republic that it says it is. Now, this is exactly the same, exactly the sin that the Chinese have constantly accused India of on the boundary dispute, saying that India, the new Indian state, had simply adopted and inherited the attitudes and legacies of the British Raj and was therefore wrong in claiming all of these territories in Aksai Chin or in Arunachal Pradesh as part of Indian territory. That was simply, that Indians were not being honest when they said that they were anti-colonial because they were willing to, they were taking on colonial territory gained by the British Raj. Part of the status seeking business is to also create a model for the rest of the world to adopt, to copy from China. So you therefore have something like the Chinese dream that Xi promotes. What is the Chinese dream? It's pretty much, Chinese dream is something that he promotes at home, but the external equivalent is some sort of a Chinese model of political and economic development, which says, well, you can have economic development, you can have the reduction of poverty without the, without political rights or civil rights. That is, that you can be or you should be happy with economic benefits, a good livelihood, as opposed to free speech and freedom of expression. Part of the status, this attachment to status, is also the why, even though several projects of the Belt and Road Initiative are in trouble, seem to be failing, the Chinese continue to stick with it. Okay, they will not let go of it because it's seen as something that they need to make it work so that they do not lose face. Now, part of all of this is also promoting the party. We talked about promoting and ensuring the legitimacy of the party at home before, but promoting the party abroad is very much also a part of the Chinese approach. I mean, we see that in Nepal, for example, both in 2019 and last year, even though the pandemic is on, that the Communist Party of China sent the International Liaison Department to conduct training sessions for the ruling party in Nepal, which also happens to be a communist party. So, and this I want you to contrast with what is happening in other parts with respect to other parts of the world. The United States has great soft power, but it does not perhaps any longer work at this in such an organized fashion as the Chinese do. The Indians used to have, the All India Radio, for example, used to have multiple language broadcasts that were targeted at its neighbors and so on. But over time, many of these have actually shrunk. So forget, promoting India abroad. What little, capacity India had in terms of reaching out abroad has also declined in many ways over time. Doordarshan, the government has been talking about launching an international network for Doordarshan, like something like the CGT and the China Global Television Network. But I'm not sure at what stage this is it yet. So, here, of course, we're talking about promoting a party, but, these methods are necessary also for promoting, your country's values, whether American values or Indian values. All of this is necessary. If nothing else, it is necessary for propaganda purposes. And all of these methods that China uses to develop its status are just increasing in complexity, increasing in scale, and taking on new means, technology. There's always resources, but also new technologies are being used, new social media platforms are being used. Ordinary Chinese citizens do not have access to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, but you will find Chinese diplomats on Twitter and on each of these platforms promoting their country's views abroad. Finally, in the next few minutes, I want to talk about China's display of power, or the Communist Party's display of power abroad. China does some things because it can do those. And it's simply human nature. And despite the rhetoric that Chinese leaders will try and do this. And one way they try to sort of push their power is to keep referring to the world as being in flux, to refer to complex security environments, to call certain parts of the globe, including South Asia, as hotspots. This is in order to justify China's actions, to create China excuses for Chinese actions in many of these parts of the world. Because without a crisis, there is no reason for China to be in these parts of the world. How can China contend with the United States and become and showcase its status both at home as well as abroad if it does not contend with other countries? And that's, you saw the sort of strong language that Yang Jiechi, the director of the Chinese Communist Party's Foreign Affairs Commission Office, used vis-a-vis at the, with the Americans at Anchorage. So it's all part of that display of power, that China has arrived, that nobody can push China around, and that China will be in different parts of the world, whether they like it or not, or whether the dominant powers in those countries and those regions like it or not. One sort of aside I want to give you here, and for those of you who are interested in anthropology, in sociology, and in elements of political communication, it's interesting to see how the Chinese present themselves. The visual politics is very important in the Communist Party of China's approach to foreign policy as well as domestic politics. This is something rather unique about, I think, communist parties in general. The military parade, and in India also, of course, we have military parades for the Republic Day and so on. But military parades, presentation of leaders, the backgrounds, etc., are very, very important as far as Chinese visual politics is concerned. You see that Xi Jinping is now sort of aping Mao Zedong in terms of the kind of places he visits, the anniversary events of different speeches that he gives, to show himself in the same light and with the same halo as Mao Zedong had. You saw that post, just recently, almost a year after the Galwan incident, China finally released the names of 4 soldiers who died. And you saw the presentation of the photographs, the kind of statements that were pulled out of their diaries. It seems to showcase them as ideal citizens. China, for those of you who know, China had this model soldier called Lei Feng in the 1950s, 60s, I think, where this was the sort of model soldier during Mao's time. But now Xi Jinping has these model soldiers for his time from the conflict with India. And remember, he's waited a whole year to pick, for sure, out of many, kill these 4 people because they have the greatest saleability, good looks and so on, and the right kind of comments that they made at some stage or the other, which the Communist Party can also sell to its own people as well as the outside world, who are taking a neutral stand as far as the India-China conflict is concerned. Also, we talked about Yang Jiechi at the Anchorage. Now there is merchandise that is being sold with Yang Jiechi's statement scolding the Americans, saying that you do not have the right to talk to us. You don't have the status or the position of power to tell China what to do. This is now part of mugs and T-shirts, etc. That is merchandise that is being sold. So you see how I suppose another way of looking at this is another example is how China plays up certain incidents in its history textbooks. For a long time, Japan's role in China during the World War or during Civil War was sort of forgotten or ignored in Chinese history textbooks. But subsequently, in the 2000s and the late 90s, 2000s, this has come up again. And now Japan is back to being an enemy country in the normal Chinese imagination. which was not the case even 30, 40 years ago, when the Chinese wanted FDI from Japan. The final point, China, like I said at the beginning, is not is not perfect. It continues to make mistakes, but mistakes the Chinese see also as opportunities for learning. So they are bold enough to try different things, difficult things. They make mistakes, but they pick themselves up again and they learn. This too is power, the capacity for reflection and self-correction. And I think we underestimate how much power is a result of course correction. I mean, look at the United States. They had Trump. They course corrected, and hopefully, they have course corrected. And you see the sort of speed and alacrity and the firmness with which they are dealing with China. At least for now, we'll see whether how long it lasts. But there it is. So the Chinese also have this capacity. I mean, this capacity needs to be underlined. They are not going to stand on ceremony. They are willing to renegotiate. So, Rajapaksa lost and Sirisena came to power. Nawaz Sharif lost and Imran Khan came to power in Pakistan. Now, both of these leaders had criticized China during the election campaigns. But as soon as the election campaign was over, they won. The Chinese ambassador was in their office trying to sweet talk them and tell them, well, all will be well. We are ready to work with you. So you might call this free of morals and free of ideology, but it works in many ways. And this is actually the stuff of international politics in many senses. Though how sustainable it is for democracies to behave like this is a different question. But I think India also faces this problem right now when, for example, with respect to Afghanistan, where India refused to talk to the Taliban, but now finally see that the horse that they backed, the democratic government in Kabul, is not capable of keeping the country stable or controlling the entire country, and now are beginning to consider whether they need to look at Taliban as partners to talk to, and so on. So finally, I think that really might be the biggest difference possibly between China and other great powers in history, that they are willing to learn from their mistakes, to adopt new methods and technology, to study the lessons of the past. And if you get the opportunity, there's this famous TV series that the Chinese had during the 80s, 90s, I think, the 80s, about the great powers in history. I think there were about 16 great powers that the Chinese saw as role models to learn from in their own quest for greatness. But remember, this was done well before China reached the sort of power and capacity it has today. So this sort of preparation for power is something that the Communist Party has always trained its people, itself as well as its people in. And I will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob, for that very insightful talk. And participants may wish to ask questions. If you have any queries or questions, kindly address them to Dr. Jacob.
Okay, so I will go ahead and I will ask the first question probably. So we talk about the international image, how China tries to change the narrative to secure its international image, both in domestic, both like inside and also outside. But actually, this is the question. It's a very layman question. Also, it's keep coming to my mind. Like, why China? If China wants to secure its image, then why first of all then it starts for example that you talked about the Twitter, using of Twitter. So in Twitter, they know that no one gonna believe, no one is going to believe in what they are tweeting, but still, like, why they keep persistently, why they keep doing it, some sort of engaging in some sort of conversations, and also like trying to keep by themselves and to themselves keep saying things like, okay, we are this power, we are that power. So what they are going to gain from that?
Okay, thank you, Jayashree. I think the first point is that it is not correct to assume that they are not being effective, that people aren't believing them. Um the entire purpose or the practice of propaganda is to keep going at it, such that you create the element of doubt in people's minds about whether what they believe in is true or not. And even if it's 100% true, to create that element of doubt is itself a victory for propaganda. That's how all propagandists work. You shout a lie 100 times, it becomes a truth, right? It's a very Goebbelsian mode of operation. So all successful propaganda is that. I mean, it's a sine qua non of propaganda that you keep at it. You do not give up just because you think that you're not getting the attention or hits. But people are reading it. People might not be reacting to it, but people are reading it, and the effect is not immediate. The effect is over time. Uh, the thing is, if the Chinese create doubt about the origin of the virus, there are many countries that will say, okay, or many people, even if countries will not say, people will say, well, who knows where it started, right? Just that question is enough of a victory for China. And mind you, for a country that starts with a disadvantage in terms of reputation, like China does, to create that kind of doubt itself is great. And practice that, there's the Chinese actually now employ their money. There are companies that they hire to tenders out for. Foreign companies are willing to do this for them. Internet management, internet account management, or social media management for the Chinese. The Chinese pay money to Westerners who manage the Twitter account, ensure so many followers, ensure constant tweeting, promoting, etc. So it takes a lot of alertness on the part of civil society in other countries, governments, other governments, to ensure that this doesn't become a sort of a new kind of a pandemic, this post-truth world which the Chinese are trying to encourage, and which is why Twitter has started this new thing about designating accounts as Chinese government or government accounts. But now it doesn't do that only for Chinese government accounts. It also does that for United States government accounts. So it has put China and the United States on the same plane, whereas that's not really the truth.
Excuse me. Hi, my name is Michael Gigante. I'm from George Mason. I'm a PhD student there. I was wondering, so you mentioned a little bit about the foreign response to the CCP's foreign policy, and I wonder what is their perception of the Quad and the recent kind of developments with that security dialogue? Does it help China's? I mean, this might kind of go against logic, but does it kind of help China's idea of status? They're desiring for status as like a world power, or are they changing what they're doing in the hopes that they don't increase cooperation between other states against China's moves? Thank you.
Thank you. So to answer the first question first, which is what are the Chinese views on the Quad? There are two views. I mean, Wang Yi, the current Chinese foreign minister, made this very famous statement many years ago that the Quad would be like foam of the sea that would just disappear. But that's not the case. But sort of relating also to Jayashree's question, the Chinese, remember the Quad it came up many years ago. But the first iteration fell through because the Chinese issued a démarche to all the embassies, and the Australians buckled. So in that sense, that just the threatening was enough to stop the Quad in its tracks. And for 10 years, those 10 years cost these other four countries, because that's the period where China grew in strength, militarized the South China Sea without much opposition, and so on. So there's that part. But in terms of a response, there's two kinds of response. On the one hand, the Chinese say the Quad doesn't matter, etc. But on the other hand, the Chinese are going hammer and tongs and criticizing the countries involved, saying, they're calling it an Asian NATO. I mean, if you're calling it a nation NATO, then you obviously think it's something important. There is a serious security concern here. So the Chinese are trying both things, and I think it also reflects the confusion or the dilemma that the Chinese face. So, to answer the second part, yes, in a sense, you could say that this raises China's status, because they are going to sell it as 4 countries against 1, right? That none of these countries are strong enough or powerful enough to deal with China one-on-one, but they had to come together, right? At the same time, this worries the Chinese, because if these 4 countries come together, obviously, they're going to be able to do a lot more than they would do individually. In fact, one way, Chinese are sort of past masters at this divide and rule business, where, in ASEAN, for example, they have prefer to deal with countries bilaterally. Even on the South China Sea dispute, where everybody is involved, they said, no, we will deal with everybody bilaterally. We will not deal with this as a multilateral issue. Okay, and because dealing bilaterally is more helpful for the Chinese. But here we have a case where the Quad is actually a multilateral organization, or well, not quite an organization, but a multilateral grouping that seems willing to work together to deal with the challenge posed by China. So, in a sense, one has to complement all 4 countries, at least for now. We'll see how long it lasts. But for not, being egotistic enough to try and tackle China by themselves, that they have understood their limitations and that they know that they need to work together to tackle the kind of force that China has become.
Hello, Jamina.
Hi.
My question is now regarding China, which has an inward-looking society and it is getting more and more as the time passes. While at the same time, China is increasing its assertive, if not aggressive, approach via foreign policy with the rest of the world. How do you see this sustaining itself in momentum in the future, especially after 2050 and so on and so forth? Will the society keep increasing their inflexibility in their worldview, or will there be a change? Will there be a flux? How will this inconsistency of an inward-looking society and a more outward-looking China at the government level work out, in your opinion?
Well, that's a $1 million question, and frankly, I wouldn't want to go so far as 2050 and so on. What I can sort of speak a little more confidently about is the here and the now, maybe the next 5 or 10 years. It's not quite true that this is an entirely inward-looking society. I mean, in many ways, the Chinese and Indians are very alike. Chinese go abroad, they want Chinese food. Indians go abroad, they want Indian food. If any of you are serious about doing China studies, then you got to be able to eat whatever is on the plate before you, because it's a big window to their culture, to breaking ice, to be able to eat and drink with them. And frankly, I have had great times in China doing precisely this. But it's not quite the case that they are unwilling to learn or to sort of understand what the rest of the world is like. China wouldn't have gotten this far if they had closed themselves off to the outside world. And not only have they been open, not only have they wanted to copy and imitate and achieve the same level of prosperity and power that the Americans have had, they now want to go over and beyond it. So you achieve the basics and then you decide, okay, now how do I reshape the world in my image? So that is where China is at right now. And that cannot be done if you're only inward looking. What the Chinese are doing is refer more and more to their own traditions, their own cultures, which is why I said right at the beginning that this is a modern political party, but that is based very much on, under Mao, it was the 4 roles: get rid of old traditions, old customs, superstitions, etc. But this China is very happy to take Confucianism, use elements of Taoism, etc., to strengthen the political party in power, as well as create a new narrative for China itself that the rest of the world can buy in. Remember, Confucianism spread from China to Japan to Korea. And Chinese products were always spreading to the different parts of the world. So the Chinese want the best of that, while also trying to revive this sense of self. It's ultimately insecurity. This happens also in India. your reference to the past increase because you tend to feel that your present doesn't provide you enough of a leg to stand on. That you are insecure about your present, which is why you tend to refer more and more to these imagined glories of the past and so on. And not just imagined glories, but also imagined victimization by foreigners. So parties like the Communist Party of China and perhaps those closer home do two things. One, they promise that we shall revive this ancient glory, all right? And two, they promise that we shall, provide an answer or provide restitution for these crimes by the foreigners against our culture and against our land and so on. So, which is why you have this tendency to want to get back territory, even though it was never your territory or perhaps has never been your territory for hundreds of years. So I think this dichotomy will continue for all, I suppose, old powers like China and India, perhaps less so for countries like the United States. But even in the United States, you see this entire "Make America Great Again." I mean, this is, even though this country is barely 300 years old, they already have this concept of civilization and some sort of a historical memory in which they were great once upon a time and no longer great again. So I suppose this is something that all countries sort of deal with. It's not unique to China, but it perhaps might gain a unique virulence in China because of a number of factors. The Communist Party in power, regime, protection of regime interests rather than the interest of all Chinese. All of those things might actually lead to problems, and this is still playing out. So I'm sorry, I don't have a sort of a definite answer to your question, but I suppose some miles or sort of some markers to finding that answer.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. I am Lomai. I'm also a faculty of this department in Tezpur University. So you have mentioned about this thing, China's internal as well as foreign policy, about how they try to balance out or how they try to learn from the mistakes on that context. But on the other hand, we also see how stern or the kind of stance they take on the Xinjiang issue or Hong Kong issue. Then we also have this the bringing of prodigal child back to China or on Taiwan issue, recently creating this pineapple war and all. So, sir, how do you see China's or the CPC's position when they think of protecting the regime's image and the impact of all these factors on foreign policy? Then the other thing is on China's position, because now we cannot deny the role of on international issues like the Myanmar issue also. So how do you see the stand of China on Myanmar and its relation, as well as the effect it will have on other geopolitical relations?
Okay, thank you. So two questions there. Nationalism is a tiger that people can't get off from, because if you try to get off, the tiger will eat you, right? And the Chinese, and not just the Chinese, but I think the Indians as well, sort of are on this tiger. And the only way that you can sort of escape this dilemma, or you really don't escape it, you just make sure that the tiger doesn't stop. Keep riding the tiger, right? So on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, I think, each of these, and Taiwan, each of these are slightly different issues coming from different historical contexts, but the objective that the Communist Party has set for itself is the same. From the Indian context, let me put it this way. I think that's a much better example that, why the Chinese say that we have resolved a boundary dispute with 14 other countries, but not with India. Okay, that means that the Indians, there's something wrong with the Indians. Is actually the silliest argument around, because there's nothing wrong with the Indians. The problem is that the Chinese, India is one country here that, where the Chinese have a much longer, much more serious historical dispute with. When the Chinese say that they want to resolve the boundary dispute with India, they are essentially asking India to accept that Tibet was historically a part of China, which is bunkum, which is something that India cannot accept because it was not true. So the thing is, the Chinese will never, settle the boundary dispute with India precisely because they are unable to make the political compromises. Because since the Dalai Lama is outside, and the struggle for the Communist Party of China in TAR, in Tibet, Tibetan regions, is to show that they represent Tibetan interests better than the Dalai Lama. So, therefore, Tawang or parts of Arunachal Pradesh, which the Tibetans claim were historically theirs. Again, history this way can go on. Nobody is absolutely right or nobody is absolutely wrong. But because they say Tibetans say Tawang was historically part of Tibet, the Chinese cannot not say that. Because that would mean that the Chinese are not capable, that at some future date, like in the case of this coronavirus thing, such party suspects that at some future date, the Tibetans will turn around and tell the communist regime that you did not protect Tibet's interests, you gave away Tawang to the Indians. So it's just not possible. So here on the Indian side, Dalai Lama has said Tawang is part of India and so on. Now that he said it, the Chinese cannot say it at all, because otherwise how are they different from the Dalai Lama, right? So I think that's the issue there. On, Hong Kong, I think it was always coming, that it was a fool's dream to imagine that the Chinese would ever let Hong Kong be this freewheeling democracy. Because remember, this has an impact on Chinese citizens. As more and more Chinese travel to Hong Kong or are on internet, etc., they're going to ask, why the hell am I suffering here? Why can't I go and read some sleazy book or some, scandalous book of Xi Jinping's mistresses or mistresses of Communist Party officials? All of this used to happen when you used to go to Hong Kong airport. You could get these books. Now all of them are out. Nothing. I mean, Hong Kong is completely under control of. So it was always going to happen, and it was a mistake to imagine it would not happen. The British, though, wanted to get the best out of it, so they signed this deal. And forget 50 years, it barely lasted 20 years, right? Taiwan is another question, because Taiwan is interesting because once upon a time, a large number of Taiwanese actually thought they were Chinese. That one day the Republic of China would, they also believed in one China, that the Republic of China would get control over the rest of China. But over time, Taiwanese identity has developed so strongly that even though many people will say that they prefer the status quo, more and more people in Taiwan are identifying themselves as Taiwanese. And seeing what happened in Hong Kong, they are now beginning to react. Okay, this one country, two systems is entirely dead. Now that creates its own problems. We don't know what sort of reaction that will generate in the Communist Party of China. And you know that they are preparing for war. And at some point, it feels necessary for the Chinese to show muscle. How much will you only talk of war and not fight a war, right? Again, it's like the tiger that you ride, because the Communist Party says that we can protect Chinese interests. But how do you protect Chinese interests if you do not show how you're good at battle, right? So you decide to pick a battle with the Indians to test out your army and so on, right? And you see, okay, whether they're capable of something or not. And you socialize the people to accepting battlefield casualties, because no war can come without casualties. In India, we are used to fighting wars and insurgencies. We are used to body bags. In China, they are not used to it. So they need to get used to this as well. Final question on Myanmar. Again, a dicey situation where China has multiple BRI projects in Myanmar, and it has to walk a very fine line. Unlike in Sri Lanka or Pakistan, where you're dealing with political parties separately, here you're dealing with the junta, a military junta which is all powerful, which is sometimes can behave quite irrationally and don't care for the consequences. Remember, at one point of several years ago, the Myanmarese military Air Force essentially bombed the China border. In the Kokang region, and the Chinese couldn't do anything about it because it would look like a big power hitting back against a smaller power. They were essentially targeting rebels and so on. And now you see the case of several Chinese factories being burnt attacked in Myanmar. such that the Taiwanese companies have started putting up a Taiwanese flag. So to come back to the previous question, it's ironical that China's growth has actually sharpened the distinction between China and Taiwan, such that Taiwanese companies abroad are trying to protect their assets by putting up Taiwanese flags and say, no, we are not Chinese. All right. So this will continue to play out. I think this remains to be seen. But it's one thing is clear that, unlike in the past where the European Union and the United States were big players in Myanmar, today it'll be countries like China, India, Japan, ASEAN that will be the major players. And China will definitely complicate the situation. There's no doubt about it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
No, I don't hear anybody asking any questions. Well, I suppose it's gone on long enough, and Davira, I think, or Jayashree, I think you can take over now.
So yeah, just before Jayashree does, let me thank you all for your attention. I think the questions were also quite pointed and complex. So thank you for those questions. It actually gives me a lot of food for thought as well. Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation and giving such an interesting lecture. I, for one, have enjoyed it a lot. I mean, I learned a lot, and also about United Front and Liaison Department. I think we have before also we have talked about how this the training works, and it's also one of my focus on not on the training works but also on the forums, as you already know. So it's been a great learning for me as well. So now I ask Devaru Lanamai from the department to say the vote of thanks to the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayashree. A very good afternoon to one and all present here today in our virtual webinar. And it has been a very fascinating and engaging time we have had today. But please bear with me for a few more minutes, because this program will be incomplete without expressing our gratitude to everyone involved to make this day a success. First, I would like to take the privilege to thank our speaker, Dr. Jabin Jacob. Sir, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, also sparing your precious time to be with us today. And also thank you so much for engaging us and imparting valuable knowledge on Communist Party of China's foreign policy. I would also like to acknowledge our university's contribution, in particular our Honorable DC, Professor Vinod Kumar Jain, our Registrar, Dr. Biren Das, and the backbone of our department, Dean, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and head of our department, Professor P.K. Das, for trusting, guiding, providing us resources, and always being a solid support system to our department. My special and heartfelt thanks to Ms. Jayashree Bora, visiting scholar in our Department of Foreign Languages, Tezpur University, and research scholar from School of International Relations and Public Administration, Shanghai International Studies University, China, for coordinating and giving a shape to this wonderful webinar. My special mention to my colleagues, Ms. Pallavi and Mr. Ratiji Chakraborty, who are always there at the background, keeping check and making sure everything goes smoothly and filling in whenever necessary. And a very special thanks to another important person, our technical assistant, Mr. Amarnath Shah, who despite all his other engagement is always there to assist and help us right from day one when this idea of this webinar came into, and making sure this program takes place successfully for us today. And finally, my biggest thanks to all the participants here today, because without your participation, our webinar will be meaningless. And thank you all for participating so enthusiastically, for the productive discussions, and for taking the dialogue forward. Thank you, everyone, and have a very wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.